Welcome back to God's story and our sacred journey, Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In the last episode, we experienced the joy of worship as shepherds and wise men came to see the Savior. Today, the story takes a darker turn, as King Herod's fear and jealousy spark a dangerous plan to harm the child. How will the Holy Family escape this threat? Let's find out. Herod sat alone in his chamber, the golden flicker of torches casting long, jittering shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city's life filtered in. Merchants haggling, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the occasional wail of a restless child. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, mingling uneasily with the faint tang of sweat and oil. Herod's fingers drummed against the armrest of his ornate throne, a restless rhythm betraying the tempest that churned within. He had been king long enough to know when danger was close. Today it arrived not as an army at his gates but in a whisper, a rumor that had crept through the halls of power like a wraith. A child, they said, a child born to be a king. His mind recoiled at the thought, yet his hands tightened their grip on the gilded chair as if to anchor himself to his throne. Kings do not surrender to fear. And yet, fear had taken root. The chamber doors creaked open, revealing a servant, his face pale with a mixture of reverence and unease. Behind him, the trusted counselor, the keeper of secrets, stepped forward, bowing low. The man's robe swayed as he moved, a ripple of crimson and ivory against the cold stone floor. "Your Majesty," the counselor began, his voice a practiced blend of respect and urgency. "The sages from the east have arrived. They bring troubling inquiries." Herod raised an eyebrow, his expression a mask of indifference. Yet his heart raced, each beat echoing louder than the last. "What inquiries?" he asked, his tone clipped but deliberate. "The ones seek the child," the counselor replied, his eyes darting to the floor. "The one born under the star," they followed. "They call him the King of the Jews." The words struck Herod like a blow to the chest. He leaned forward, the velvet cushion beneath him creaking softly. The golden crown upon his head suddenly felt heavier, as though burdened by the weight of a future he had not foreseen. "A king?" he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. The counselor nodded. "Yes, Majesty, they believe he is foretold by the prophets, destined to reign." Herod's mind raced. Prophecy. It was a word he loathed, slippery, ungovernable, unbound by the rules of men. He had crushed rebellions, silenced dissenters, and built monuments to his power. But prophecy was not a foe one could strike down with a sword. It seeped through cracks, whispered in corners, and planted doubt in the minds of the faithful. "Bring them to me," Herod commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. "And summon the scholars. I want every prophecy, every scrap of scripture that speaks of Bethlehem." The counselor bowed again and withdrew, leaving Herod alone once more. He stared into the shadows that danced across the chamber walls, their twisting forms a cruel mockery of his unraveling thoughts. A king must act decisively, he reminded himself. Yet, as he gazed into the flickering light, Herod could not shake the feeling that his throne, for all its gilded splendor, was no fortress against the forces now stirring beyond his reach. Herod's private study was shrouded in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of parchment and the muted murmur of voices. The scholars huddled together like nervous sheep, their robes whispering as they exchanged furtive glances. Scrolls and ancient texts lay sprawled across the marble table, their worn edges speaking of countless hands and countless years. The faint smell of aged leather and ink mingled with the cold, dry air of the chamber. Herod paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, the hem of his robe brushing the floor with every deliberate step. He had summoned the scholars at dawn, leaving them no time to prepare or protest. Now they stood before him, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting from him to the texts, as though searching for refuge. But there was none. "Tell me," Herod began, his voice sharp and cutting through the room like a blade, "what do the prophets say of this child? Of Bethlehem?" One of the scholars, an elderly man with a stooped back and trembling hand, stepped forward. His voice wavered as he spoke, reciting words that had been etched into the annals of faith for centuries. "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Herod stopped pacing, his gaze fixing on the old man like a predator sizing up its prey. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "A ruler," Herod repeated slowly, as though tasting the bitterness of the idea. "One who will shepherd my people?" The old man nodded, his eyes avoiding Herod's piercing stare. Another scholar, younger and bolder, stepped in. "The prophecy has long been known, Majesty. Bethlehem is small, but it carries the weight of history. If this star they speak of truly marks the birth of such a child—" Herod's fists slammed against the table, sending scrolls tumbling to the floor. The scholars recoiled as though struck, their faces blanched with fear. "Enough!" he roared. "I do not need your riddles and tales. I need facts. This child, if he exists, threatens everything. Do you understand that?" The younger scholar swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "Yes, Majesty, but—" "What? Nothing," Herod snapped, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. "I will not have my throne stolen by some phantom child. Call the Magi. I will meet them. They will tell me where this so-called king lies." The scholars exchanged uneasy glances but dared not protest. Herod leaned over the table, his hands gripping its edges as he stared at the scattered scrolls. His knuckles whitened, and his breath came in slow, measured bursts, each one simmering with barely contained rage. As the scholars retreated, Herod straightened, his mind churning with plans. He would use the Magi to manipulate their quest for this child, and when the time came, he would crush this prophecy under the weight of his will. The throne was his, preordained not by stars or scriptures, but by power and blood, and he would defend it no matter the cost. The chamber grew still once more, save for the faint hiss of torches along the walls. Herod's eyes gleamed as he stared into the flickering flames, their chaotic dance mirroring the storm within him. He would find this child, and when he did, no prophecy, no star, no god could save him. The night was dense and heavy. A vast tapestry of black stretched taut over the sleeping town of Bethlehem. Inside the modest dwelling, Joseph lay in restless slumber, his body still but his brow furrowed, as if his dreams bore the weight of the world. The air within the room was cool, carrying the faint scent of straw and the earthy aroma of worn wood. Nearby, Mary and the child rested peacefully, their soft breaths harmonizing with the occasional creak of the old timbers. Then it happened. The stillness chattered, not with sound, but with presence. A light, soft and golden, began to emanate in the corner of the room, growing brighter until it filled the space with an otherworldly glow. Joseph stirred, his eyes fluttering open. What met his gaze stole the air from his lungs. Before him stood a figure cloaked in radiance, its features both sharp and gentle, as though carved from the very essence of light. The angel's eyes held an intensity that pierced Joseph's soul, but within them was also a profound gentleness, a comfort that stilled the pounding of his heart. "Joseph, son of David," the angel began, its voice resonating like the deep hum of a temple bell, each word steady and weighted with divine purpose. "Rise and take the child and his mother. Flee to Egypt and remain there until I bring you word, for Herod seeks the child to destroy him." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on Joseph. He sat upright now, his breath shallow as the enormity of the message settled over him. Herod, his name alone carried dread, but to know the king sought harm to this innocent child, the one foretold, the one cradled in Mary's arms, it was unthinkable. But Egypt, Joseph's thoughts raced. The land was distant, unfamiliar, a place of exile. How could they travel such a perilous journey with so little? Yet even as the doubt surged, the angel's presence seemed to quell them. It stood unwavering, its gaze steady, as though it already knew Joseph's heart. "Do not delay," the angel said, as if reading his mind. Its voice softened, but lost none of its urgency. "Go, now, under the cover of night. The child's life depends on it." Joseph nodded, his resolve hardening. The angel lingered for a moment longer, its form luminous against the dim room. Then, As suddenly as it had come, it was gone, leaving behind a faint warmth in the air, a reminder of its divine origin. Joseph rose from his bedding, his movements quick but deliberate. He crossed the room to Mary, his hand gently touching her shoulder. She stirred, her eyes opening to meet his, and in her gaze, he saw the question before it formed on her lips. "Mary," he whispered, his voice low but firm, "we must leave. Now. An angel of the Lord has warned me. Herod is seeking the child." Mary's eyes widened and she clutched the baby closer to her chest, instinctively shielding him. But there was no hesitation in her movements as she began to gather what little they had. Her faith mirrored Joseph's, a quiet strength that would carry them through the darkest of nights. As Joseph prepared their donkey and gathered the modest provisions, he cast one last glance at their home, now shrouded in shadows. This place, though humble, had been a sanctuary. But sanctuaries were fleeting in times of danger. With Mary and the child safely seated, Joseph took the lead, guiding them out into the starlit night. Overhead, the heavens stretched vast and silent, and though the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. The angel's words, though urgent, carried a promise. They would be guided, and they would endure. The room was a flurry of quiet urgency. Joseph moved with purpose, his hands deftly gathering what little they had to offer, a satchel of bread, a flask of water, the tools of his trade. Each movement was swift and precise, yet burdened by the weight of necessity. The angel's warning echoed in his mind, clear and unrelenting. He had no time to question, no luxury to hesitate. The night was their shield, and they had to move before dawn betrayed their escape. Mary watched him, her eyes wide but steady. The infant lay cradled in her arms, his small face serene against the chaos around him. She whispered a prayer under her breath, her words a quiet plea for strength, for safety. Her faith was unshaken, but her heart ached at the thought of the journey ahead, a journey into the unknown, with dangers lurking in every shadow. "Joseph," she called softly, her voice cutting through the rustle of cloth and the creak of the wooden floor. He turned to her, his face lined with worry yet resolute. "Are we ready?" He nodded, his jaw set, his eyes meeting hers with a silent promise. "We must be," he said, his voice firm but low, as though speaking too loudly might summon the dangers they sought to flee. He stepped closer, his rough hands brushing against her arm. "The child, he is our priority. We cannot fail." Mary's grip on the child tightened, her gaze dropping to the small bundle in her arms. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet she stood tall, her resolve as unyielding as Joseph's. Together, they were stronger than fear. Joseph swung the satchel over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room one last time. It was not much, a simple dwelling, humble in its offerings, but it had been a sanctuary, however brief. Leaving it behind felt like abandoning a piece of themselves, yet the greater call demanded it. The door creaked softly as Joseph opened it, the cool night air rushing in to meet them. The world outside was still, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Shadows stretched long and deep, their edges sharp against the earth. Joseph stepped out first, his eyes darting to the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. The streets were silent, the city asleep, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst. Mary followed, her steps light, her every movement careful to avoid waking the child. They slipped into the shadows, their figures blending with the night as they began their journey. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the dirt road, their breathing quiet but labored. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet they pressed on, driven by a purpose greater than themselves. The road stretched out before them, winding and uncertain. The distant hills loomed like sentinels, their dark silhouettes both a promise and a warning. Joseph's hand found Mary's, a silent reassurance that they were not alone. The stars above seemed to guide them, their light a faint but constant reminder of the divine presence that had set them on this path. Behind them, the city of Bethlehem lay in peaceful slumber, unaware of the danger that crept through its streets. Ahead, the unknown awaited, its challenges hidden in the folds of the horizon. But for Joseph and Mary there was no turning back. Their journey had begun, and with it, the fulfillment of a plan far greater than their own. The desert stretched before them, a vast expanse of shadow and moonlight. The sand, cold and unyielding underfoot, whispered with each step, a hushed reminder of the isolation that surrounded them. Joseph led the way, his figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the night, a quiet sentinel guiding his family through the wilderness. Each step was deliberate and measured, as though the weight of his duty steadied him even against the uncertainty of the path. Mary followed closely behind, her arms cradling the child who lay swaddled in the warmth of her embrace. The child's breath was soft and steady, the rise and fall of his tiny chest a rhythm that seemed to echo Mary's whispered prayers. Her eyes flicked to the horizon, where the faint outline of distant dunes rippled like waves frozen in time. The night was still, the vast emptiness around them broken only by the occasional murmur of wind as it brushed against the sparse shrubs. Above, the stars burned fiercely, their light sharp against the velvet blackness of the sky. Among them was the one star, brighter and more steadfast than the rest, a beacon that seemed to guide them through the vast, unending darkness. Joseph glanced upward, his lips moving in silent gratitude. The star had been their compass, its unwavering glow a reminder of the purpose that drove them forward. The terrain grew uneven, the ground shifting beneath their feet as they climbed a low ridge. Joseph extended a hand to Mary, his calloused fingers firm and steady against hers. She accepted his help without a word, their shared silence speaking volumes in the language of trust and mutual resolve. Together, they crested the ridge, their breaths misting in the cold air as they paused to take in the view below. The desert opened up like a vast, otherworldly sea, its surface rippled with shadows and silvered by moonlight. The journey ahead seemed endless, the road vanishing into the darkness as though swallowed by the very night itself. But neither of them hesitated. There was no room for doubt, no time for fear. Joseph turned to Mary, his voice low but steady. "We're making good progress," he said, though his tone carried a hint of weariness. "Just a little further, and we'll find a place to rest." Mary nodded, her gaze lingering on the child in her arms. "He's strong," she replied softly, a small smile touching her lips. "He hasn't stirred once." The words, simple as they were, carried a profound weight. The child's calm, his serenity, seemed to radiate outward, a quiet strength that fortified them both. They pressed on, their steps sinking to an unspoken rhythm, the sound of their movement blending with the whispering sands. As the night deepened, the cold grew sharper, biting at their skin despite the layers of cloth they wore. Joseph tightened his cloak around his shoulders, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. The desert was unforgiving, its beauty tempered by the harsh reality of its emptiness. Yet, even in the desolation, there was a sense of purpose that drove them. The journey was not theirs alone, it was a thread in a tapestry far larger than they could comprehend. Each step forward was a step into the unknown, yet they walked with the certainty that their path was not without meaning. The stars above remained steadfast, their light unwavering as it guided them onward, and so they walked, their figures small against the vastness of the desert, yet unbroken, their faith a fire that burned brighter than any star. The soldiers moved like shadows, their cloaks blending with the night as they marched through the narrow streets of Bethlehem. Torches flared, their fiery light casting eerie shapes on the stone walls of sleeping homes. The faint clatter of armor and the muffled commands of officers were the only sounds, a grim overture to the darkness that followed them. Herod's decree was clear, brutal in its simplicity. No boy under the age of 2 was to be spared. The air was thick with the scent of oil-soaked wood and the cold metallic tang of steel. Beyond the town's borders, the world lay cloaked in silence. The stars above watched impassively, their cold light falling on the rocky paths and sparse trees that dotted the barren landscape. It was here, amidst the emptiness of the wilderness, that Joseph, Mary, and the child pressed forward. Each step felt heavy, as though the weight of Herod's intent bore down on them. Joseph gripped the reins of the donkey tightly, his knuckles pale against the coarse leather. The animal trudged on, its hooves striking soft thuds against the earth. Mary sat atop, her arms wrapped protectively around the child, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her face, though serene, carried a quiet determination, her faith a shield against the terror that pursued them. The road was unforgiving, jagged stones hidden in the soft shadows cast by the flickering light of a lone star above. It seemed to guide them, its steady glow piercing the inky sky. Joseph's gaze flickered upward now and then, his lips moving in silent prayer. Each step forward felt like defiance, a declaration that they would not be broken, even as the odds seemed insurmountable. Behind them, Bethlehem was waking to horror. The cries of mothers pierced the night, a cacophony of grief and anguish that echoed across the hills. Joseph could feel those cries like a physical force, a reminder of the danger they fled and the lives that Herod's cruelty had shattered. He tightened his grip on the reins, urging the donkey forward with soft words, his voice calm despite the turmoil within. Mary looked down at the child in her arms, his small face illuminated by the faint light of the star. He slept soundly, untroubled by the chaos around him. She marveled at his innocence, the purity of a life untouched by fear or sorrow. Yet, in her heart, she carried a mother's fierce resolve. This child was more than her son. He was a promise, a light destined to shine in the darkest places. She would protect him with every ounce of her strength. The terrain grew steeper as they neared the edge of the wilderness. The path wound through narrow passes, the rocks on either side looming like silent sentinels. Joseph paused to catch his breath, his ears straining for any sound that might signal pursuit. But there was only the wind, whispering through the trees, and the faint rustle of leaves disturbed by nocturnal creatures. As they pressed on, a sense of peace began to settle over them, fragile, yet undeniable. The cries from Bethlehem faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic sound of hooves and the soft murmur of Joseph's prayers. The star above seemed to burn brighter, its light a beacon of hope in a night fraught with despair. They did not know what lay ahead, the trials, the dangers, the uncertainty of life in a foreign land, but they moved forward, their faith unyielding. For now, in the stillness of the wilderness, they were safe, cradled by the vast expanse of the desert and the quiet promise of a star that refused to dim. Herod stood at the window of his grand chamber, the first light of dawn casting a pale glow over the city below. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the rooftops, as though searching for the whispers of defiance that lingered just beyond his grasp. The ornate crown upon his head felt heavier than ever, a burden of power that now seemed threatened by forces unseen. The door behind him creaked open, and the captain of his guard entered, bowing low. Herod did not turn but spoke, his voice cold and clipped. "Is everything prepared?" "Yes, Majesty," the captain replied, his tone steady but tinged with unease. "The soldiers await your command." Herod turned then, his gaze piercing. His robe swirled around him like a storm as he strode toward the captain. "Then give the order. Let no child under 2 years of age remain alive in Bethlehem or its vicinity." The captain hesitated, a flicker of humanity flashing across his face. But Herod's expression was unyielding, carved from stone and shadow. "Do you question me?" Herod asked, his voice low and dangerous. "No, Majesty," the captain said quickly, bowing his head. "It will be done." Herod watched as the man departed, the sound of his boots echoing down the marble corridor. Alone once more, Herod returned to the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The morning was quiet, too quiet, as though the city itself held its breath in anticipation of the horror to come. He did not feel remorse. Remorse was a weakness, a crack in the armor of power, and Herod could not afford cracks. The prophecy had left him no choice. This child, this supposed king, would grow to challenge him, to tear down the empire he had built with blood and stone. He would not allow it. Beyond the palace walls, the soldiers began their grim march. The streets of Bethlehem, so often filled with the chatter of market vendors and the laughter of children, now resonated with the steady rhythm of boots on cobblestone. Doors were pounded upon, cries of confusion and terror rising as the soldiers entered homes, their mission unspoken but unmistakable. In one house, a young mother clutched her infant son, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered prayers, her voice shaking. The soldiers' shadows fell across her doorway, and she held her child closer, as though sheer will could shield him from the world's cruelty. Herod remained at his window, watching as the sun rose higher, bathing the city in a light that felt indifferent to the suffering below. He imagined the chaos, the wailing, the fear, and he told himself it was necessary. To rule was to sacrifice, and sacrifices were seldom clean or just. But as the hours passed, a strange stillness settled over the palace. The weight of what he had unleashed pressed upon Herod, not as guilt, but as a reminder of the cost of maintaining power. He turned from the window, retreating into the shadowed depths of his chamber. Outside, the cries of Bethlehem continued to echo, a haunting chorus that would linger long after the soldiers had departed. In the heart of the city, amidst the grief and devastation, a prophecy remained unbroken. The child, the one Herod had sought to destroy, was gone, carried away into the night by a family whose faith and courage had defied a king's wrath. And though Herod could not know it, the very act meant to secure his throne had only hastened the fulfillment of the words he feared most. The streets of Bethlehem were silent at first, as though the town itself had been struck dumb by the enormity of what was unfolding. But the silence did not last. It was broken by the first cry, a mother's voice, raw and piercing, echoing through the narrow alleys. It rose above the muffled clamor of soldiers' boots and the sharp commands barked in the cold morning air. From house to house, doors were forced open, wooden frames splintering under the weight of iron-shod feet. Soldiers moved methodically, their expressions grim as they carried out their orders. Some bore the stoic detachment of men hardened by war, while others hesitated, their eyes betraying the turmoil within. But none dared disobey the decree of the king. Inside one modest home, a father stood with his arms outstretched, shielding his wife and child. His voice, hoarse with desperation, pleaded for mercy. The soldier before him hesitated, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. But duty overpowered doubt, and the father's cries were silenced. The mother's wail followed, a sound so guttural and raw that it seemed to scrape against the very fabric of the morning air. In another part of the town, an older woman clutched her grandson to her chest, her frail arms trembling but unyielding. She stared down the soldier who towered over her, her eyes filled with defiance. "You will not take him," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. The soldier froze, caught between the command he had sworn to follow and the humanity he could not entirely suppress. But his hesitation was brief. Another soldier stepped forward, his blade swift and unfeeling. Bethlehem became a symphony of sorrow, each cry and plea adding to the cacophony of grief. The air grew thick with the sounds of anguish, the kind of mourning that burrows deep into the soul and leaves scars that never fade. Mothers clutched at empty cradles, their hands trembling as they screamed into the void. Fathers sat motionless, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes staring at nothing as they grappled with the weight of their loss. The soldiers, their grim work done, began to withdraw, their boots crunching against the blood-stained earth. They carried no trophies, no spoils of war, only the weight of their actions and the haunting echoes of the cries they left behind. High above the town, the sky remained indifferent, its soft blues and golds unmarred by the horrors below. And yet, amidst the devastation, there were whispers of something unbroken. The child Herod sought was not among the fallen. In the midst of the pain and loss, there was a flicker of hope, a small, fragile flame that no sword or decree could extinguish. Bethlehem lay shattered, its streets and homes filled with the echoes of a tragedy that would be remembered for generations. But even in its darkest hour, the town bore witness to the enduring promise of a light that could not be snuffed out. The cries of the mothers, though rooted in despair, carried a truth that Herod could not erase. The prophecy lived on. The old shepherd sat on a worn rock at the edge of the field, his gnarled hands resting on the weathered crook of his staff. Around him the hills stretched endlessly, their gentle slopes bathed in the soft golden glow of the setting sun. His flock grazed nearby, their quiet movements blending into the stillness of the evening, but his eyes, clouded with age and sorrow, were fixed on the distant horizon, where the smoke of Bethlehem's tragedy still lingered like a dark scar against the fading sky. He had seen many things in his years, droughts and floods, the rise and fall of kings, the small joys and great hardships of life on these hills, but nothing had prepared him for the horror of this day. The cries of the mothers, the sight of the soldiers moving from house to house with grim determination, the knowledge that innocents had been slaughtered. It was a weight too great to bear. The shepherd closed his eyes, the memories flashing like lightning behind his lids. He had heard the whispers in the marketplace, the rumors of a child, a king born under a star. He had seen the star himself, its brilliant light piercing the night sky just weeks ago, filling him with awe and a strange sense of hope. And now, that hope seemed shattered, scattered like the ashes of Bethlehem. "Why?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and low, as though the question was directed at the earth itself. "Why does such darkness fall upon the innocent?" A rustle behind him drew his attention. He turned slowly, his old bones protesting, to see a young boy standing at the edge of the field. The boy's face was streaked with dirt and tears, his small hands clutching a lamb to his chest. The shepherd recognized him as one of the children from Bethlehem, a boy who had somehow escaped the carnage. "Come, child," the shepherd said, his voice soft and steady, though his heart ached at the sight. "Sit with me." The boy approached cautiously, his wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. He sat beside the old man, the lamb trembling in his arms. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply sat together, the silence between them filled with the unspoken weight of all they had seen. After a time, the shepherd began to speak, his voice low and measured, as though telling a story to the wind. "There was a time when I was your age," he said, "when the fields were my whole world, and the stars above were a mystery I couldn't understand. I learned then, as I have learned now, that the world is full of shadows. But shadows, child, are not the end." The boy looked up at him, his tear-streaked face questioning. The shepherd continued, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Even in the darkest of nights, the stars still shine. Even when the wind howls and the wolves prowl, there is a shepherd to guard the flock. And even when men do their worst, there is a promise, a light that cannot be extinguished." The boy's grip on the lamb loosened slightly, and he leaned closer to the old man, as though drawn to the warmth in his words. The shepherd placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "We may not understand why such things happen," he said, "but I believe with all my heart that the child they sought was not lost. He lives, and with him, so does hope." The sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays painting the hills in hues of deep amber and crimson. The old shepherd and the boy sat together as the first stars appeared overhead, their light faint but unwavering. In the silence of the coming night, the promise of something greater lingered, a promise that, even in the shadow of Herod's cruelty, there was a light that would endure. Thank you for following this intense chapter of Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with your loved ones and leave your comments below. In the next episode, we'll follow the Holy Family as they flee to Egypt and find safety in a foreign land. Make sure you're subscribed to God's Story with notifications turned on so you don't miss what's next. Until then, stay blessed.